I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, Morally Bankrupt. Long before the headlines called him Machine Gun Kelly, he was just George Kelly Barnes. He was a quiet, well-dressed boy from a family that believed manners could outrun fate. He was born in Chicago in 1895, the only son of George and Elizabeth Barnes. Hardworking, middle-class people who believed that their boy would never know want or need. His father owned a modest hardware business. His mother was the kind of woman who ironed her husband's shirts and her son's future in the same breath. Pressed, polished, predictable. George was not the kind of outlaw who grew up hungry. He grew up restless. When he was still a boy, the family moved south to Memphis, Tennessee, chasing business opportunities and a slower life. Memphis was polite, proper, and segregated, the kind of place where rebellion had to hide behind a grin. George learned early that charm could smooth almost anything. He was not tough. He was not wild. He was likable. He was the kind of young man who looked you in the eye, even when he lied. He went to Central High School and enrolled at Mississippi State University, where he studied agriculture. Not law, not business, agriculture. He wanted a quiet life, working the land, or at least that's what he told himself. But the 1910s were changing fast. Jazz was rising, prohibition was coming, and the thrill of getting away with something started to feel better than doing the right thing. By the early 1920s, George was out of school, out of work, and right on time for America's next great mistake. Prohibition. The country that had outlawed alcohol had just invented its next profession. The bootlegger. George Kelly Barnes slipped into crime like it was destiny. At first, it was simple, running whiskey across Oklahoma and Texas for quick cash. Not guns, not gangs, just a car, a map, and a growing list of bad friends. He was handsome, polite, and smart enough to stay unnoticed. The kind of bootlegger who tipped bartenders and kept his word. He was not a killer. Not yet. He married young, had a son. For a while, it looked like he might straighten out. But money moves faster than morality. When federal agents cracked down on the southern liquor routes, he was arrested in Tulsa, served a short stint at Leavenworth Prison, and came out with new friends, the kind of men who didn't just smuggle whiskey, they robbed banks. Starting to sound familiar? That's where George Barnes stopped pretending to be good. And that's where Kathryn Thorne, the woman who would give him both his nickname and his downfall, found him. If George Kelly was the mask, Kathryn Thorne was the one who painted it. She was not born poor, she was born ordinary. And that, in her mind, was worse. Kathryn was born in 1894, somewhere between small-town respectability and small-time trouble. By the time she reached her 20s, she learned that a woman could survive on beauty, but she could rise on nerve. She married young, divorced fast, and carried herself like the world already owed her something. But she really came from ambition. Kathryn had 2 failed marriages by her late 20s. Both husbands were working men. Both promised stability, and both disappointed her. She was not built for a quiet kitchen or a front porch life. She wanted fame. The kind of fame that came with headlines, jewelry, and a name people whispered with fear. By the time she met George Kelly Barnes, she already had a reputation of her own. Pretty, unpredictable, and dangerously persuasive. He was charming, but small-time, a bootlegger with decent manners and poor instincts. To Kathryn, that wasn't a flaw. It was potential. She saw what George could not, that America was falling in love with its criminals. Dillinger, Capone, Floyd. The country was broke, but it was entertained. The papers didn't report on crime anymore, they sold it. And Kathryn was smart enough to see an opening in the market. She bought him a gun, the Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy. Heavy, loud, theatrical. She told him to pose with it. Smile a little, she said. Make them believe it. She mailed those photos to the newspapers and underworld contacts across the South, signed them with his new name, Machine Gun Kelly. She was the first publicist of crime. George did not create his own myth. Kathryn did. She understood branding before branding had a word. A man with a gun was a threat. A man with a nickname was a franchise. But Kathryn was not a cartoon villain. She was a woman trying to claw power out of a system that gave her none. In a world where women were expected to stand behind their men, she built one she could stand in front of. Her hunger for control made her dangerous, not because she loved violence, but because she loved what violence promised. Respect, fear, freedom. She'd sit in hotel rooms with a cigarette, dictating to George what kind of man he was supposed to be. He didn't push back. He liked the attention. And somewhere between the whiskey and the photo ops, the line between pretend and reality disappeared. Machine Gun Kelly robs bank in Texas. Machine Gun Kelly strikes again. FBI targets new public enemy. Kathryn smiled every time she saw his name in print. George just stared at it, like a man looking at his own obituary written in real time. Kathryn didn't just make a legend, she made a monster she could not control, and a man who could not stop pretending. Every outlaw has a first mistake, the one that teaches them crime pays better than honesty. For George Kelly Barnes, that lesson came wrapped in a whiskey bottle. It was the early 90s and America had just outlawed alcohol. The 18th Amendment promised virtue. What it delivered was opportunity. In Oklahoma and in Texas, bootlegging was not rebellion, it was business. Kelly was still trying to live straight then. He was married back then. He was raising his young son. He was trying to make ends meet as an oil-filled hand. But the wages were low and the road to responsibility was long. His first job in crime was not glamorous. He started as a runner, driving illegal whiskey across the county line, small-time routes from Fort Worth to Tulsa, back in a jiffy and paid in cash with a little bit of danger. He was not robbing banks or waving guns. He was driving fast, keeping quiet, and praying he would not get caught. He was caught anyway. And as I had mentioned prior, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for illegal liquor transport. This was his first known offense. It was not violent. It was not clever. It was the crime of a man who wanted more than the world was willing to give. The newspapers barely noticed. Just another prohibition bust, another man in handcuffs. But for Kelly, the arrest was a turning point. He was sentenced to time at Leavenworth Federal Prison, where men with long records and longer stories became his new mentors. That's where George learned the code of the underworld. How to keep your mouth shut, how to plan a job, how to disappear, just like all the rest that I have discussed in this series. He entered a bootlegger with good manners, and he walked out a career criminal and waiting. But let's remember, Leavenworth did not harden him. It rewrote him. He was not built for violence yet, but he learned the value of reputation. The men inside told him something he never forgot. You don't have to be tough, kid. You just have to make them think you are. When Kathryn met him, he was handsome and courteous and maybe even still naive. And Kathryn saw something malleable, a man she could turn into a myth that she wished she could be. She wanted fame. She wanted to belong. Together, they found their formula. You have to think that at some point, George was probably scared, inside his head, seeing what was going on, what she was making him into, even though he was complicit in participating. I'm sure he was a little scared, because suddenly George was famous for crimes he hadn't even committed. Bank robberies in Texas, heists in Kansas. Every time a Thompson gun barked, someone said, "It's Machine Gun Kelly." Kathryn loved it. George kept his mouth shut. He didn't argue. Fame, even false fame, was better than, I guess, being a nobody. The first confirmed Machine Gun Kelly robbery happened in 1932. It was a small town bank in Texas. The haul was not huge, but the press was. He walked in calmly, told the tellers no one needed to die. His gun was in his hand, and he walked out with a few $1,000s and a myth that grew with every retelling. Witnesses described him as polite, almost gentle. He didn't curse. He didn't panic. The headlines, of course, told a different story. Machine Gun Kelly terrorizes Texas town. That was Kathryn's genius. She knew how to make fear look like power. And the more the country believed it, the more George started to believe it too. Federal agents are on the lookout tonight for Machine Gun Kelly, public enemy number 1. The nickname stuck like a curse. And 1933, Kathryn's thirst for fame led them to one crime that would make them legends and destroy them both. The Urschel kidnapping. And that's exactly what he did. When he got out, he did not go back to George Barnes. He became George Kelly, the name of a man who'd pretend to be dangerous until the world made him believe it. The Urschel kidnapping. The price of fame. Going back in time to July 22nd, 1933, Oklahoma City. The night air was heavy with heat and money, the kind of quiet wealth that hides behind manicured hedges and good manners. Inside a stately home on Nicholas Hills, oil tycoon Charles F. Urschel was hosting a small card game with friends. He was calm, intelligent, cautious, the kind of man who locked his doors and kept his wits. But no lock or wit could save him that night. Around 11 p.m., 2 men burst through the front door, wearing masks, guns drawn, shouting for everyone to hit the floor. The robbers were George Machine Gun Kelly and his partner, Albert Bates, following a plan Kathryn had helped design. Kathryn wanted a headline crime. A bank job was not big enough anymore. Kidnapping a millionaire now. That would make the papers. Kelly barked orders with a tremor in his voice, polite but panicked. He tied up the guests, demanded cash, and forced the oil tycoon into a waiting car. But in their haste, they made a fatal error. There were 2 men in the house who looked alike. For a moment, Kelly grabbed the wrong one. Only when the tycoon's wife screamed his full name, "No, not him, Charles," did Kelly realize the mistake. He swapped victims mid-abduction. That's how nervous he was. They drove through the night across Oklahoma into Kansas to a secluded farmhouse outside Paradise, Kansas, owned by Kathryn's mother and stepfather, R.G. and Ora Shannon. The house was remote, surrounded by wheat fields and silence. There, the oil tycoon was blindfolded and chained to a chair. Kathryn handled the negotiations herself. She demanded $200,000 in ransom. Kathryn managed the details with ruthless precision. She instructed Kelly what to say, wrote the notes herself, and monitored the calls. Kelly followed her lead like a stage actor reading lines he did not understand. When agents later asked who gave the orders, every witness said the same thing. The woman ran the show. While he was captive, Charles made a decision. If he lived, he'd remember everything. Blindfolded, he counted the seconds between train whistles, listened to airplanes overhead, tracked when the roosters crowed, and noted the temperature shifts through the floorboards. When they forced him to play cards to pass the time, he memorized every sound, every voice, every accent. He was terrified, but he was also brilliant. When they finally released him, he had enough sensory data to locate the exact farm where he'd been held. The ransom was delivered without a hitch, $200,000 in marked bills worth nearly $4 million today. Kelly and Kathryn celebrated like royalty, champagne, new clothes, hotel suites. For a brief moment, they were everything she dreamed they would be: rich, feared and famous, but the money did not last long and neither did their luck. Agents traced the ransom bills through the banks in Memphis and Kansas City. Then came the tip. A farmer who'd seen a blindfolded man in a field near Paradise, Kansas. When agents raided the Shannon farm, they found fingerprints, rope, and maps. It was over. Kathryn, her mother, and several accomplices were arrested. George fled to Memphis, drinking heavily and spiraling. Within weeks, federal agents had him surrounded in a farmhouse, unarmed, half drunk, and already defeated. He stumbled to the porch, hands shaking, and said the line that would immortalize him. "Don't shoot, G-men. Don't shoot." No gunfire, no fight, just surrender, and a myth that would outlive them all. The ransom was recovered, the victim testified, and within months, both George and Kathryn Kelly were sentenced to life in prison. Hoover called it the greatest triumph in Bureau history. But for Kelly, it was the final curtain on a performance he never really actually wanted to star in. Or did he? The man who once feared being invincible had become unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. He was a man who mistook fear for power and married a woman who knew the difference. George Kelly Barnes did not build his own legend. The papers did. Kathryn fed it. And as always, J. Edgar Hoover sold it. The truth was simple. Kelly robbed a few small-town banks. He kidnapped one oil man, and then he surrendered without firing a shot. But the story America heard, the one printed in bold black letters, was something else entirely. Machine Gun Kelly, public enemy number one, armed and dangerous, shoot on sight. When they got a hold of George Kelly, a man easier to catch, easier to brand, and much easier to use, his capture was bloodless. His surrender, so humble. But that did not sell. So they rewrote that scene. The morning raid became a heroic shootout. His trembling plea, "Don't shoot, G-men," became proof of the Bureau's bravery. Hoover took the phrase and turned it into a weapon of image. It appeared in radio shows, posters, even a Hollywood film. Machine Gun Kelly, coward, criminal, and marketing gold. The public loved it. America wanted to believe that anyone, could bring order to chaos, and Hoover gave them that myth. And Kelly became the first man sacrificed to build it. We're not talking about a kingpin. We're not talking about a killer. He was a prop in a larger performance, a symbol of fear polished in propaganda. A nation so desperate for control, it turned a trembling man into a monster, because in America's war on crime, the truth was never the first casualty. It was the first strategy. The courtroom in Oklahoma City in 1933 was packed. Spectators lined the walls, reporters filled the aisles. The crime that had terrified the nation was finally on trial. And J. Edgar Hoover made sure the spotlight never left his stage. The defendants sat side by side, George Machine Gun Kelly and Kathryn Thorne Kelly, surrounded by a parade of federal agents in crisp suits. Hoover had ordered the Bureau men to dress sharp, act confident, and sit where the cameras could see their faces. It wasn't just a trial, it was a production. George looked lost. He kept his hands folded, eyes down, glancing at Kathryn for cues. She, on the other hand, was radiant. Hair done, lipstick perfect, her posture regal, as though she were the star of a film premiering before a live audience. Even in chains, she controlled the room. Prosecutors built their case around Charles's testimony, the ransom bills, and the rope found at the Kansas farmhouse. But the real evidence was not the money or the fingerprints, it was the story. The one Hoover's men had already told the press. Machine Gun Kelly, the cold-blooded gangster who terrorized the nation, finally brought to justice by the fearless G-men of the FBI. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Both were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, the harshest penalty ever delivered for a kidnapping at that time. Reporters described Kelly's expression as bewildered. No joke. Could you imagine? He wept quietly. Kathryn, however, smiled, a strange, satisfied smile. Maybe she believed she'd won in her own way. After all, her name was in every paper in America. She had built a legend, and legends don't need freedom to live forever. For Hoover, it was a triumph as always. He personally congratulated the agents and himself, posed for photographs, and claimed credit for every detail of the investigation. The Bureau's reputation was reborn once more, efficient, fearless, untouchable. Within months, Congress passed new laws granting the FBI expanded powers, which was interstate authority, modern weapons, and jurisdictions over kidnapping. So George and Kathryn Kelly were clearly criminals, but they were also examples. Behind the courtroom walls, the real story had already been rewritten. A timid bootlegger had become a national menace. A manipulative woman had become a femme fatale. And Hoover's bureau, once mocked as incompetent, had become America's savior. This trial did not end a crime spree. It launched an empire. The myth of Machine Gun Kelly was sealed in that courtroom. And the cost of the myth, the truth, the man, and the woman who invented him was buried beneath Hoover's headlines. For the Bureau, it was the birth of power. For George Kelly, it was the end of pretending. And for Kathryn, it was a victory written in lipstick and ruin. When the cameras left the courtroom, George Kelly Barnes became just another number. Inmate 117, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. In Leavenworth, the guards did not call him Machine Gun. They called him Kelly. No sir, no swagger, just Kelly. He was polite, obedient, and even cheerful. He swept floors, polished brass, played cards with other inmates. He signed autographs for guards and joked about the nickname he never wanted. "They call me Machine Gun," he'd say, "but I ain't never shot one in anger." When reporters visited, they expected arrogance, menace, something cinematic. Instead, they found a man deflated, soft-spoken, still calling his captors sir. He told one journalist, "I was never a big shot. I was just trying to live up to a story that wasn't mine." Even in prison, he still could not escape that myth. Inmates whispered his name like a campfire story. "That's the G-Man they caught. He's the one who said, 'Don't shoot.'" To them, he was a celebrity. To himself, he was just an accident. In 1934, Hoover's bureau opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. It was a fortress on the water, built to hold men who had outgrown fear. George Kelly Barnes was among its first residents. Here, the air was colder, the walls were thicker, the nights were quieter, even than Leavenworth. If Leavenworth broke your spirit, Alcatraz erased your name. He spent 17 years there, reading, writing, and aging. No shootouts, no escape attempts, no rebellion, just silence and the slow decay of a legend. Without Kathryn's ambition to define him, he became George again. The farm boy, the son, the man who once wanted a quiet life on a farm. He told a prison chaplain, "I used to think fear made a man strong. Now I know it just keeps him company." 1951, Kelly was transferred back to Leavenworth. He was older, frail, and forgotten. He died there in 1954 at the age of 59 of a heart attack in the prison infirmary. There was no press, no headlines, no myth left to sell. The man who once defined the public enemy era quietly died unarmed, unseen, and unremarkable. His death was not tragic, it was ordinary, and maybe that is what is so haunting. After all of that noise, he'd end up exactly where he started, another man the world forgot to care about. They buried him under his real name, George Kelly Barnes, in the family plot back in Oklahoma. No one called him Machine Gun anymore. Just George. The man who became a myth died as a memory. If George Kelly's story ended in surrender, Kathryn Thorne Kelly's story ended in defiance. Even in prison, she refused to admit defeat. She once told a reporter, "George got soft. I never did." After their arrest, Kathryn was sent to the women's federal prison in Cincinnati, then later to the reformatory at Alderson, West Virginia. And that is the same one that would later house Martha Stewart, long after crime became chic again. But back then, it was a warehouse for forgotten women. The world outside had moved on. Dillinger was dead, Bonnie and Clyde were dust, and the Public Enemy era had become nostalgia, a flickering black and white fantasy America told itself to forget. Kathryn did not break. She became a celebrity behind bars. She bragged about the kidnapping, about building Machine Gun Kelly from scratch, and about teaching men how to be feared. She was proud, not of what she'd done, but what she'd created. "They all think he was dangerous," she once said. "He was not. But they think I was, and that's better." Over the years, Kathryn kept writing letters to journalists, lawyers, old friends, anyone who would listen. She'd sign them Miss George Kelly, not out of love, out of ownership. The name was still currency, even after the myth went bankrupt. She fought for parole, claiming good behavior and fragile health. The irony was hard to miss. The woman who once staged crimes for attention now promised to disappear quietly if they would just let her go. 1958, after 25 years, Kathryn Kelly was finally released. The papers barely noticed. There was no welcome home, no headlines, no flashbulbs waiting by the gate. She faded into the background of Memphis, working as a bookkeeper under a different name, living in a rented house, her famous fire reduced to flickers. When she died in 1985, she was 81 years old. She had no family and no visitors, just a short obituary that called her a woman once connected to a famous outlaw. She outlived her husband, outlived the era, but not that story. Because the truth was, Kathryn never wanted freedom. She wanted immortality. And in that way, she got what she wanted. Every photo, every headline, every reprint of one quote, "Don't shoot, G-Man," was still her handiwork. The myth of Machine Gun Kelly did not die with him. It lived on through her shadow, the woman who made fear fashionable, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in America is not a gun in a man's hands. It's the story a woman teaches him to believe. George Machine Gun Kelly was the face of a man who believed a story about himself until the story became a cage. He was scared, and the world mistook his fear for fame. Kathryn turned that fear into fuel. Hoover turned it into propaganda, and the public turned it into entertainment. That's the real crime of the 1930s, not the guns or the getaways, but the performance of violence dressed up as justice. To Kathryn, he was a product. To Hoover, he was a brand. To America, he was proof that evil had a face, and that system still worked, but underneath the myth was just a man who'd rather surrender than shoot, and a woman who'd rather be infamous than invincible. The coward in the gun, the man who never fired it, the woman who made sure that he held it. Together, they taught America something it still has not forgotten: that fear sells faster than truth, and that power is never as dangerous as the people desperate to look like they have it. I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, Morally Bankrupt. The story of George Machine Gun Kelly is not about crime or punishment. It's about performance, about the stories that we tell to survive and the lies we choose to remember. Next time, from Dillinger to Ma Barker, from Bonnie and Clyde to the last man standing, we unravel how America fell in love with its own darkness. The myths we built, the lives we bought, the morals we buried. Creepy Krampus is up next. You've been listening to Deadly Truths, Morally Bankrupt. This is Becca. If this story made you think twice about heroes and headlines, share it, like it, follow. Wherever you get your podcasts, every share helps these forgotten histories stay alive, and every follow helps this project grow. The research and narration is always done by me. I'm sure you can tell. Sources for this episode include FBI case files, U.S. District court transcripts, the Oklahoma Historical Society archives, Public Enemies by Brian Bureau, and Alcatraz inmate correspondent records. Because in the end, the past is not dead. It's just doing time in the FBI's classified files.